Hello everyone, it's Saturday, and you know what that means, right? That's right, it's time for me to talk about an animated superhero television episode. Today, I will actually be talking about a two-part episode from Batman the Animated Series. This episode is from the first DVD box set, and it is called TwoFace. This episode opens with the Gotham PD raiding one of Rupert Thorne's buildings and arresting a few of his men. Rupert Thorne is a gangster, and the number one thorn in his side is District Attorney Harvey Dent. We very quickly find out that Harvey has anger issues when he attacks one of Thorne's men in front of the news people. We find out that Harvey has been seeing a psychiatrist, and from her we find out that ever since he was a child, Harvey has essentially had a second personality buried deep within himself called Big Bad Harv. I am not a scientist, so I won't sit here and try to tell you that he has schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder, because I honestly don't know the difference, or if this show is even air quotes accurately portraying what Harvey has here. Anyway, Harvey is running to get re-elected as district attorney, but Thorne has lifted his psych file and is basically wanting Harvey to back off of his operations. Well, Big Bad Harv emerges, chases down Thorne, and then because one of Thorne's goons is an idiot, some stray gunfire causes an explosion which scars Harvey's face on the left side. The first half of this story ends with Harvey escaping the hospital, clearly shook up after he sees his face for the first time. The second half of this story begins 6 months later, where Harvey has two goons working for him and is now hitting up establishments owned by and run by Rupert Thorne. We see now that he makes every decision by consulting his coin, and instead of being two separate personalities that jump back and forth to being in charge, it seems like both personalities have merged to form the new person that is Two-Face. Thorne decides to put a $2 million reward out for whoever brings him Two-Face, and then his lackey tricks Harvey's fiancée into leading them to Two-Face. Batman is able to stop Two-Face from killing Thorne, and then we have a somewhat bittersweet ending in that Two-Face does not die, but he's not the man we once knew either. So I've mentioned this every time the character of Harvey Dent showed up in this cartoon before this episode, but I really wish we could have had more of a sense of who Harvey was before this episode. I really feel that this would enhance the tragedy of his accident and his fall from grace, no pun intended, because his fiance's name is... oh, never mind. And I'd now like to add that it would have been nice if Harvey's psychological issues could have had more of a presence in this series before now. I don't really know how that could have been done, to be honest. If we could see that Harvey is hiding something in an episode that is supposed to focus on Man-Bat, then that might make it seem like it is obvious to every character that Harvey is messed up. And I think the thing these people are going for is that nobody could ever see that Harvey is heading down this road of becoming a messed up dude. But on the other hand, it really feels like Harvey having this second persona is just sort of invented on the spot, and it doesn't really feel like an organic growth of the character for two reasons. One, we haven't seen any evidence of this yet, and two, we haven't really gotten to see Harvey as a character before this episode. He's been in 2 or 3 episodes before this one, and only in one of them was he featured heavily, and even then he was really just a plot device for the episode. And speaking of things that just sort of happen out of the blue, Two-Face's obsession with his coin. I know that in On Leather Wings we saw him casually flipping his coin whenever he was talking to Gordon and Bullock, and then any other time we saw him, he wasn't flipping the coin at all. And then in this episode, it seems like the coin is just something Big Bad Harv does, and it doesn't really seem to have any significance. It's just something he does, I guess to signify that he has switched over to Big Bad Harv. The coin is really just in the background more or less until the second half of this episode, when suddenly it is very significant and it is what drives Two-Face's decisions. I know that in such a short amount of time there's not very much time to establish everything that needs to be established, but I do wish that we could have had more of an explanation as to why Two-Face uses the coin. It certainly seems to me that Big Bad Harv is getting stronger and stronger in this episode, so if he is, why bother with dividing his time between Good Harv and Bad Harv? Why doesn't Bad Harv just put away the coin and do bad stuff all the time? I know that's not who the character of Two-Face is, but this episode really isn't setting up the character of Two-Face. They're taking things in an entirely different direction, and then it's like halfway into this story, they realize that they needed Two-Face, so they skip a few steps to get there. At least, that's how it feels like to me. I also have trouble buying that Harvey and his fiancée Grace have such a loving, strong relationship, since like 3 episodes ago, Harvey was dating Poison Ivy and was ready to propose to her after dating her for like a week. Maybe if we had had more of Harvey being set up as DA and we got to see him dating Grace for a while, then this would have felt more like a natural and organic relationship instead of something that is forced and contrived like it is. You may have noticed in my summation of the story that Batman isn't very involved, and that's because he's not. He helps in the raid at the very beginning of the first episode. I'm convinced because the writers really couldn't find anything to do with him. And that's fine, really. I know that this is Batman the Animated Series, but the previous episode was more about Jordan and his father reconciling, and less about Batman. So I think it's fine to let some episodes focus more on the people of Gotham, and maybe how the city changes them, and how they have an impact on the city itself, etc. I do like how, in the second episode, we see that Bruce equates his failure with Two-Face to his failure to save his parents. And I get that guilt drives the Dark Knight in some versions, but I would have kinda hoped that Bruce would be smarter than this. He knows that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly do anything to save his parents, right? But outside of this dream sequence at the beginning of the second part of this episode, Batman again doesn't really have much to do. I'm not sure why I'm mentioning this, because, as I said, I'm fine with him sometimes being put in the background for an episode. I just feel like the people behind this show want Batman to have a lot to do here, and he really doesn't. And if they want me to feel like Batman has truly lost a friend, which I think they do want me to feel that, then Batman being mostly background in this episode is not great. Moving forward, I feel like having the second part of this episode be half a year later is a little absurd. In 6 months' time, Rupert Thorne did not do anything about Two-Face hitting up his joints. This second episode begins with someone saying, "I thought we finished this guy," to which Thorne's other lackey says, "No, we just created him." Why are you asking this now, after Two-Face has been attacking your enterprises for half a year? This episode could have just as easily been 3 weeks later, and you wouldn't have had to change a single plot element. In fact, many of these elements would even make more sense. I can buy that Thorne would finally lose his patience with Dent after 3 weeks, but it's a little hard to buy that he's able to keep his cool for 6 months. I can buy that the police would come to Grace and give her the beacon thing and say that Dent would come to visit her 3 weeks after his escape, not 6 months. And yes, I know that that wasn't really the police, but Grace thought they were, and she should have been suspicious of cops investigating a case that went cold months earlier. I guess this does put an emphasis on Batman's failure to save Harvey, but he still fails at the end of the episode. Couldn't he have failed 3 weeks later, just as easily as he failed 6 months later? Also, final complaint, I promise. As a standalone story, this episode works great. And if we were never going to see Two-Face again, this episode would work for the most part. But Two-Face's entire motivation is his desire to get back at Rupert Thorne for ruining his life, right? So the next time we see Two-Face, he's going to be doing something entirely different, correct? This is something that I feel like happens very often with just about any supervillain. You give them an origin and a reason for doing evil things, but then that origin doesn't really hold up for an extended period of time, and in fact makes the entire character sort of pointless upon further appearances. It'd be fine if Two-Face continued to try and take down Rupert Thorne in future appearances, but I know that that's not a thing that's going to happen from now on. In a lot of ways, this reminds me of the Mr. Freeze origin story, which I'll be covering in a few weeks, give or take. Both have a pretty good origin story for a one-time villain who then becomes a recurring villain who has an origin that no longer works for his motivation for being a villain. Overall, it certainly sounds like I did not enjoy this episode, and I really did as a standalone thing. But this is not a standalone thing. This is part of a series, and as part of a series, I feel like it just does not work as well as it had the potential to work. And even on its own, it has some problems I wish it had fixed. Oh well, that's about all I have to say about this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, even if you disagree with my opinions on this episode. I hope you guys will take the time to comment, share, like, and subscribe, and I will be back next week to talk about an episode of the Legion of Superheroes television series. Until then, keep it real, folks.